There are moments in life when everything you believe to be solid crumbles in an instant. Mine came on a Tuesday morning, with the sound of my own daughter's voice saying words I never imagined I would hear. "Stay away from me, Mom. You're disgusting." I had been living in my daughter Sarah's house for 3 years, ever since my husband passed and left me with nothing but memories and medical bills. At 58, I thought I had found my place again, helping with my granddaughter Emma, cooking the meals Sarah never had time for, keeping the house running while she built her career as a real estate agent. That morning started like any other. I was making pancakes for Emma before school, humming softly while the batter sizzled in the pan. My chronic cough, the same one I'd lived with for 20 years due to a lung condition from my factory days, acted up again. It was nothing serious, just a persistent tickle that made me cough into my elbow, the way doctors always recommend. But Sarah walked into the kitchen at that exact moment, dressed in her expensive blazer, her perfectly styled hair catching the morning light. She froze when she heard me cough, her face twisting into an expression I'd never seen before. Pure disgust mixed with something that looked like fear. "Mom, what is that cough?" she demanded, stepping backward as if I were carrying some deadly plague. I tried to explain, like I had countless times before, that it was just my old condition, nothing contagious, nothing dangerous. The same cough she'd heard throughout her entire childhood, the same one that had never stopped me from taking care of her when she was sick, from staying up all night when she had fevers, from working double shifts to pay for her college. But she wouldn't listen. Her eyes darted around the kitchen, landing on Emma's plate, on the pancakes I'd been preparing with the same hands that had fed Sarah for 32 years. "You've been cooking for Emma? Breathing all over her food?" Sarah's voice rose to a pitch I'd never heard before, sharp and accusing. "How could you be so careless?" The words hit me like physical blows. Emma looked up from her coloring book, confusion written across her 7-year-old face as she watched her grandmother become the villain in her mother's eyes. I tried to remain calm, to explain once more that my condition wasn't contagious, that I'd raised Sarah herself with this same cough, that 20 years of medical appointments had confirmed it was simply chronic bronchitis from my years working in textile mills, damage done long before Sarah was even born. But Sarah was already pulling out her phone, speaking to someone I couldn't see. Her husband, Mark, I realized, was on a video call from his business trip. "Mark, she's been coughing around Emma again. I can't take this risk anymore," Sarah said, her voice carrying the authority of someone who'd made an irreversible decision. I stood there, spatula still in my hand, watching my daughter discuss my fate with her husband, as if I were a problem to be solved, rather than the woman who had given her life meaning. If you enjoy emotional stories like this one, please subscribe to our channel. We're working toward 1,000 subscribers, and it really helps our work. And comment below to tell us which city you're watching from. The conversation that followed felt surreal, like watching a movie about someone else's life. Sarah explained to Mark how uncomfortable she'd become with my presence, how my cough made her nervous around Emma, how she felt it was time for me to find my own place, as if I had anywhere to go. As if the Social Security check I received each month could cover rent in a city where she'd chosen to live because it was up and coming, which apparently meant expensive. Mark's voice crackled through the phone speaker, distant but decisive. "We discussed this might happen eventually, honey. We can't put Emma's health at risk. Your mom needs to understand." Needs to understand. I had understood plenty in my 58 years. I understood what it meant to work 2 jobs to keep food on the table. I understood what it meant to choose between buying myself a winter coat or paying for Sarah's school supplies. I understood what it meant to smile and say, "Of course, sweetheart," when Sarah announced she was getting married and needed help paying for the wedding because Mark's family expected something appropriate to their social circle. What I was struggling to understand was how the daughter I'd sacrificed everything for could look at me now like I was a burden she'd finally found the courage to discard. "Sarah," I said quietly, setting down the spatula with hands that were trying not to shake. "We've talked about this before. My condition isn't contagious. I've had it for 20 years. Dr. Peterson explained." "I don't care what Dr. Peterson said 20 years ago," Sarah interrupted, her voice taking on that sharp edge she'd perfected in her real estate career, the tone she used to close deals and shut down objections. Things change. Emma's health is my priority now. Emma's health. As if I would ever do anything to harm my granddaughter. The little girl who ran to me when she scraped her knees, who asked me to braid her hair because I was better at it than Mommy, who fell asleep in my lap during our Sunday movie afternoons. I looked at Emma then, still coloring at the kitchen table, her small fingers wrapped around a purple crayon as she filled in a picture of a house with a family standing in front of it. A mommy, a daddy, a little girl, and a grandmother figure she'd drawn with gray hair and a big smile. That drawing would haunt me for months afterward, the innocent representation of what I thought we were, a family, complete, permanent, built on love that couldn't be shaken by something as simple as a cough that had been part of my reality for longer than Sarah had been alive. I think it would be best, Sarah continued, her voice becoming more businesslike with each word, if you packed your things today. Mark's sister knows about a senior community about an hour from here. It's very nice, Mom. Independent living. You'll have your own apartment. An hour away. Far enough that spontaneous visits would be impossible. That Emma would forget the rhythm of my presence in her daily life. That I would become an occasional obligation rather than an integral part of their family. The pancakes were burning on the stove, filling the kitchen with the acrid smell of wasted food and broken mornings. I turned off the burner with movements that felt mechanical, robotic, as if my body had decided to function independently of my shattered heart. And if I can't afford this senior community? I asked, surprised by how steady my voice sounded when everything inside me was screaming. Sarah's pause lasted just a beat too long, revealing the calculations she'd already made. We'll help with the deposit, she said finally, the way people discuss splitting a restaurant bill. Practical, finite, limited. The deposit. Not the monthly rent that would stretch my fixed income beyond its breaking point. Not the transportation to medical appointments. Not the gradual isolation that comes with being placed somewhere, because you've become inconvenient rather than choosing to be there because it's where you want to live. I understood then that this conversation wasn't a discussion or a negotiation. It was a notification. Sarah had already made her decision, probably weeks or months ago, and was simply informing me of my new reality. The woman who used to climb into my bed during thunderstorms, who had cried in my arms after her first heartbreak, who had asked me to be in the delivery room when Emma was born because she needed her mother's strength. That woman was nowhere to be found in the stranger standing across from me, checking her watch and mentally calculating how quickly she could resolve this inconvenience. Emma finished coloring her house and held it up proudly. Look, Grandma, it's our family. Sarah's eyes flicked to the drawing, then to me, and I saw something pass across her face. Guilt, maybe, or recognition of what she was about to destroy. But it lasted only a moment before her expression hardened again into the mask of someone who'd convinced herself that cruelty was actually kindness, that abandonment was actually protection. That's beautiful, sweetheart, I managed to say to Emma, my voice catching slightly on the words. Absolutely beautiful, because it was beautiful, and it was ending, and I was powerless to stop it. The next few hours passed in a blur of cardboard boxes and careful avoidance. Sarah had left for work immediately after our kitchen conversation, but not before calling her neighbor Mrs. Henderson to keep an eye on things, while I packed. The implication was clear. I couldn't be trusted alone in the house where I'd lived for 3 years. The house where I'd scrubbed floors, organized closets, and created the kind of warm home Sarah had never had time to maintain herself. Mrs. Henderson arrived within the hour, a woman in her 40s with perfectly manicured nails and the kind of smile that never quite reached her eyes. I'd seen her at neighborhood barbecues, where she and Sarah would huddle together discussing property values and school districts, while I chased Emma around the backyard, making sure she didn't wander too close to the pool. Oh, Evelyn, Mrs. Henderson said as she let herself in through the front door. Sarah told me about your situation. Such a difficult decision for her, but you have to understand. Emma's health comes first. There it was again. Emma's health. As if my presence in this house had been slowly poisoning my granddaughter, rather than enriching her days with homemade cookies, bedtime stories, and the patient attention that working parents rarely have time to provide. I continued folding my clothes into the suitcase I'd pulled from the guest room closet, the same suitcase I'd used for the rare vacations Sarah and Mark had invited me on, back when they still saw my presence as helpful rather than hazardous. I'm sure you understand, Mrs. Henderson continued, settling herself on the edge of my bed like she belonged there. Sarah's been under so much stress lately. The real estate market is so competitive, and Mark's promotion requires so much travel. Having you here has been wonderful, but now that Emma's getting older, she didn't finish the sentence, letting the implication hang in the air. Now that Emma was getting older, she no longer needed her grandmother's daily care. Now that the hard work of early childhood was over, my usefulness had expired. What Mrs. Henderson didn't mention, what Sarah had conveniently forgotten, was how desperately they'd needed me 3 years ago when Emma was 4, and Mark's job was demanding longer hours. Sarah had called me crying, overwhelmed by the impossible balance of career and motherhood, begging me to move in and help. Just temporarily, she'd said then. Just until things settle down and we figure out a routine. I'd sold my small apartment, donated most of my furniture, and rearranged my entire life around their needs. Temporarily had somehow stretched into 3 years of cooking their meals, doing their laundry, maintaining their household, and providing the kind of stable, loving presence that made their ambitious lifestyles possible. But people have short memories when it comes to gratitude, especially when the help they once needed becomes an inconvenience they'd rather forget. Mrs. Henderson watched me pack with the fascination of someone observing a minor tragedy from a safe distance. "Where will you go?" she asked, her tone carrying just enough concern to seem appropriate while remaining detached enough to avoid any actual responsibility. "There's a senior living facility about an hour from here," I replied, repeating the information Sarah had provided like it was a plan rather than an exile. "Independent living." "Oh, how nice." Mrs. Henderson's voice brightened artificially. "Those places are wonderful these days. Activities, social opportunities, people your own age. You'll probably love it once you adjust." People my own age. As if 58 meant I should be segregated from the rest of the world, filed away with other women whose children had decided they'd outlived their usefulness. As if wisdom and experience were diseases that needed to be contained rather than gifts that could benefit younger generations. I folded my winter coat, the one I'd finally been able to afford after Sarah got her first big commission. She'd been so proud that day, calling to tell me about the sale, promising that things were finally turning around for their family. "Our family," she'd said then. The phone rang while I was packing my small collection of books. Mrs. Henderson answered it without asking permission, as if she'd been appointed the official supervisor of my departure. "Henderson residence," she said, then immediately corrected herself with an embarrassed laugh. "I mean, Morrison residence. This is Janet Henderson, Sarah's neighbor." I could hear Mark's voice through the speaker, though I couldn't make out the words. Mrs. Henderson's responses told the story clearly enough. "Yes, she's packing now. No problems. Sarah was right to handle it this way. Of course, Emma's health is the priority." They were discussing me like a piece of furniture being removed from their house, checking to make sure the process was proceeding smoothly, that I wasn't causing any inconvenient scenes or demanding explanations they didn't want to provide. When Mrs. Henderson hung up, she turned to me with renewed authority. "Mark says the facility has an opening next week. Isn't that wonderful? Sometimes these things just work out when they're meant to be. Meant to be." As if my displacement from the family I'd helped hold together was part of some grand design rather than the predictable result of people who'd confused kindness with weakness, generosity with obligation. Emma came home from school while I was packing my bathroom supplies, the generic brands I'd always bought because spending money on myself felt selfish when there were college funds to contribute to, and family vacations I was never quite invited on. "Grandma!" she called, running up the stairs with her backpack bouncing against her small shoulders. "Mrs. Patterson gave us art supplies today, and I made you a picture." She burst into the bedroom with the pure joy that only children possess, holding up a construction paper creation covered in glued-on sequins and cotton balls. "It was supposed to be a garden," she explained breathlessly, with flowers that sparkled and clouds that felt soft like real ones. "It's beautiful, sweetheart," I said, accepting the artwork with hands that trembled slightly. How do you explain to a 7-year-old that her grandmother is being sent away? How do you maintain a child's sense of security when the adults around her are making decisions based on fear and convenience rather than love and loyalty? Mrs. Henderson stepped forward with the practiced efficiency of someone accustomed to managing difficult situations. Emma, honey, your grandma is going to live in a new place soon. A special place just for grown-ups like her, where she'll have lots of new friends. Emma's face scrunched up in confusion. But this is Grandma's home. Her room is here. Well, sometimes people need to move to new homes, Mrs. Henderson continued, her voice taking on the artificially cheerful tone adults use when they're lying to children for their own good. And your grandma's new home will be so exciting. She'll have activities and— I don't want Grandma to move, Emma interrupted, her lower lip beginning to quiver in the way that always preceded tears. Who will make my pancakes? The question hung in the air like an accusation. Who would make her pancakes? Who would braid her hair in the special way she liked? Who would listen patiently to her lengthy explanations of playground politics and help her with homework that required more patience than exhausted working parents typically possessed? Mrs. Henderson looked uncomfortable for the first time since she'd arrived. Your mommy will make your pancakes, sweetheart, or maybe you'll learn to make them yourself. Won't that be fun? But Emma was too young to understand the adult logic that justified separating people who loved each other. Too young to accept that convenience and fear could override affection and need. Too young to pretend that this change was anything other than a loss. She climbed onto the bed next to my suitcase and wrapped her small arms around my waist with the fierce determination of someone trying to prevent an inevitable disaster. Don't go, Grandma, she whispered against my sweater. I'll be extra good. I won't get sick anymore. Her words broke something inside me that I hadn't known was still intact. She thought she was the problem. This innocent child believed that her grandmother's banishment was somehow connected to her own behavior, that if she could just be better, more perfect, less vulnerable to the illnesses that occasionally kept her home from school, everything would return to normal. I held her close, breathing in the scent of her strawberry shampoo and the lingering traces of school cafeteria lunch, trying to memorize this moment before it became just another painful memory. This isn't about you being good, I told her softly. You're perfect exactly as you are. Sometimes grown-ups make decisions that don't make sense to little girls, but that doesn't mean you did anything wrong. Mrs. Henderson cleared her throat meaningfully. Emma, why don't you go wash your hands for snack time? I'm sure your grandmother needs to finish packing. The dismissal was gentle but firm, removing the child from a situation that was becoming too emotionally complicated for easy management. Emma reluctantly released her hold on me, her 7-year-old instincts telling her that something important was ending, even if she couldn't fully understand what or why. After Emma left, Mrs. Henderson's demeanor shifted subtly, becoming more businesslike now that we didn't have to perform for a child's benefit. Sarah will be home around 6, she informed me. She's arranged for a taxi to take you to a hotel tonight, and the facility will be ready Monday morning. A hotel. After 3 years of providing daily care for their family, I was being sent to a hotel for the weekend like a visitor who had overstayed her welcome. I zipped up the suitcase that contained 35 years of adult life, reduced to whatever could fit in 2 bags. Everything else, the photos Sarah didn't want, the books Mark considered clutter, the small decorative items I'd collected over decades of living, would be donated or discarded according to their convenience. As I carried my luggage down the stairs I'd climbed thousands of times, I passed the family photos lining the hallway. Pictures of Emma's birthday parties where I'd organized the games and baked the cakes, holiday gatherings where I'd cooked the meals and managed the cleanup, vacation snapshots from trips where I'd been invited to provide childcare while Sarah and Mark enjoyed adult activities. In every photo, I was present but peripheral, included but not essential, needed but not valued. I'd been so focused on being helpful that I'd never noticed how easily I could be edited out of their story when my usefulness expired. The house felt different as I waited for my taxi, as if it was already adjusting to my absence, the rooms reorganizing themselves around a family of 3 instead of 4. Emma's toys seemed to multiply in the spaces I'd always kept tidy. Sarah's work papers spread across surfaces I'd always kept clear. The comfortable order I'd maintained was already dissolving into the chaos that would become their new normal, but that would be their problem to solve. I was no longer responsible for making their lives run smoothly. The The taxi arrived at exactly 6 o'clock, its yellow bulk idling in the driveway like a hearse come to transport me to whatever came next. The Sunset Inn was the kind of hotel where people stayed when they had nowhere else to go, rather than somewhere they wanted to be. The carpet was clean, but worn, the walls painted in colors chosen to hide stains rather than create warmth, and the air conditioning unit rattled with the persistence of something that had given up trying to work efficiently, but hadn't yet been granted permission to die. I sat on the edge of the bed, staring at the 2 suitcases that now contained my entire world, wondering how a life could be compressed into so little space. The room smelled of industrial cleaning supplies and the dreams of people who'd passed through before me, each story ending with departure, just like mine. The silence felt different than the comfortable quiet I'd known in Sarah's house during afternoon hours when Emma was at school and Sarah was at work. This was the silence of isolation, heavy and complete, broken only by the muffled sounds of other people's lives bleeding through thin walls. I tried calling my sister Margaret in Phoenix, the only family I had left besides Sarah and Emma. We hadn't spoken in 6 months, not from any argument or disagreement, just the natural drift that happens when lives take different paths, and weekly calls become monthly calls, become occasional holiday check-ins. "Evelyn!" Margaret's voice carried surprise and genuine warmth when she answered. What a lovely surprise. How are things? How were things? Where did I even begin to explain that my daughter had just thrown me out of her house like I was a health hazard? That I was sitting in a budget hotel trying to figure out how to rebuild my life at 58 years old? Well, there have been some changes, I said, aiming for casual and landing somewhere closer to desperate. Sarah thinks it might be time for me to find my own place. The pause on the other end lasted just long enough to make me understand that Margaret was processing more than my carefully chosen words. My sister had always been perceptive, able to read between the lines of our family's tendency to present problems as opportunities. "Find your own place," Margaret repeated slowly. "After 3 years of living there? What happened, Ev?" I found myself crying then, tears that had been building since that morning's conversation finally finding their way out in the safety of my sister's concern. The whole story spilled out. The cough that had apparently become unacceptable, the fear about Emma's health, the boxes and Mrs. Henderson's supervision, and the taxi ride to exile. Margaret listened without interrupting, making the small sounds of sympathy and outrage that told me she understood both what I was saying and what I wasn't able to say. That ungrateful little... Margaret caught herself, remembering that Sarah was still my daughter despite everything. "I'm sorry, Ev. I know you love her, but what she's doing is wrong. After everything you've sacrificed for that girl, everything I'd sacrificed." Margaret had witnessed most of it over the years. The way I'd worked double shifts to pay for Sarah's college when her father left, the way I'd moved across 3 states to be closer when Emma was born, the way I'd always chosen Sarah's needs over my own comfort, security, or happiness. "She says there's a senior community about an hour away," I said, wiping my nose with the hotel's scratchy tissues. "Independent living. At 58? Evelyn, you're younger than half the people in my yoga class. Senior communities are for people who need assistance, not women who've been providing assistance to ungrateful families." Margaret's indignation felt validating in a way that surprised me. I'd become so accustomed to seeing myself through Sarah's eyes, aging, burdensome, increasingly irrelevant, that I'd forgotten there were other perspectives available. "Come to Phoenix," Margaret continued without hesitation. "Stay with me while you figure things out. The weather's better, the cost of living is lower, and you won't be sitting in some sterile facility surrounded by people waiting to die. Phoenix." I hadn't been to Arizona since Margaret's wedding 15 years ago, hadn't seriously considered living anywhere other than within driving distance of Sarah and Emma. The idea felt both terrifying and oddly liberating, a chance to exist somewhere I wasn't defined by my usefulness to other people's ambitions. "I couldn't impose," I started, but Margaret cut me off. "Impose? Ev, I've been rattling around this house alone since David died. You'd be doing me a favor. Besides, what's family for if not helping each other when life gets complicated?" Family. The word carried weight that seemed to have gotten lost in Sarah's calculations about health risks and social appropriateness. Margaret was offering what Sarah had withdrawn: unconditional acceptance, the assumption that my presence would be a gift rather than a burden. But Phoenix was 1,200 miles away from Emma, 1,200 miles from any chance of rebuilding the relationship with Sarah, 1,200 miles from the life I'd been working to maintain for 3 years. After I hung up with Margaret, promising to think about her offer, I sat in the hotel chair and tried to imagine what my life might look like if I stopped trying to earn my way back into Sarah's good graces. What if I stopped proving my worth through service and started building something that belonged to me alone? The thought felt both exhilarating and absolutely terrifying. Monday morning arrived with the institutional efficiency of a medical procedure. Sarah appeared at the hotel lobby at exactly 9 o'clock, dressed in her professional armor and carrying the kind of smile that looked genuine from a distance, but revealed its artificial nature up close. "Mom, you look rested," she said, which was such an obvious lie that I wondered if she'd practiced it in the mirror. I'd slept maybe 3 hours, my mind churning through possibilities and regrets with the relentless persistence of a washing machine stuck on the spin cycle. The drive to Sunset Manor took 43 minutes through increasingly rural landscape, past strip malls and gas stations, and the kind of restaurants that served breakfast all day because their clientele had given up on normal schedules. Sarah filled the silence with cheerful commentary about the scenery, as if we were heading to a vacation destination rather than a disposal facility. "The trees are so pretty this time of year," she said, gesturing toward maples that were just beginning to hint at autumn colors. "And this area is supposed to be very peaceful, great for walking, as if I'd moved to Sarah's house for the exercise opportunities rather than to help raise my granddaughter and maintain their household while they pursued their careers." Sunset Manor sat on a perfectly manicured lawn like a scaled-down version of a corporate headquarters, all beige brick and neutral landscaping designed to offend no one and inspire no one. The sign by the entrance featured reassuring phrases like active living and independent lifestyle, in fonts chosen to suggest vitality without promising too much adventure. The tour began immediately, led by a woman named Brenda, whose enthusiasm seemed powered by commission rather than genuine belief in the product she was selling. She wore the kind of blazer that matched the decor and spoke in the measured tones of someone who'd perfected the art of making institutional living sound like a conscious lifestyle choice. "Here's our community room," Brenda announced, opening the door to a space that looked like a hotel conference room decorated for a retirement party. "We have activities every day. Bingo on Mondays, craft time on Wednesdays, movie nights on Fridays." Bingo. At 58, I was being offered bingo as my primary social outlet, as if my brain had atrophied to the point where calling out numbers constituted intellectual stimulation. Sarah nodded approvingly at everything Brenda showed us: the small kitchenette with 2 burners and a half-sized refrigerator, the bathroom with grab bars installed preemptively, the closet that could accommodate maybe a third of the clothes I'd owned before downsizing my life to fit their convenience. "The dining room serves 3 meals a day," Brenda continued, "but residents are welcome to cook in their apartments if they prefer, though most of our folks find the convenience worth it." Most of their folks. I was being categorized with people who'd chosen this place because they could no longer manage independent living, people who needed the structure and supervision that came with institutional care. At 58, I was being filed away with the same administrative efficiency used for people twice my age who'd genuinely reached the point where cooking and cleaning had become unsafe. "What do you think, Mom?" Sarah asked as we stood in the apartment that was supposed to become my world. "Isn't it perfect?" Perfect. The word hung in the air like a challenge, demanding agreement with a judgment I fundamentally disagreed with. Nothing about this place was perfect for me. Not the prescribed activities that assumed intellectual decline, not the communal dining that eliminated the pleasure of cooking, not the location that placed me exactly far enough away to make regular visits inconvenient without making them impossible. But Sarah was looking at me with the expectation of gratitude, waiting for me to acknowledge that this exile was actually a gift, that being separated from my granddaughter and relegated to managed care was somehow in my best interest. "It's very clean," I said finally, which was true and committed me to nothing. The paperwork process took 2 hours, during which I signed documents that made my displacement official. Sarah wrote a check for the deposit and first month's rent, $1,847 that apparently represented the price of her peace of mind, the cost of removing me from her daily life. I know this is a big transition, Brenda said, as she handed me a welcome packet full of schedules and rules and emergency contact forms. But you'll be surprised how quickly this starts to feel like home. Home. Another word that had lost its meaning somewhere between Sarah's kitchen revelation and this sterile apartment where I was expected to be grateful for the privilege of segregation. Sarah hugged me goodbye with the kind of embrace that felt more like closure than affection, her arms briefly encircling me before stepping back to a safer distance. "I'll call you tonight to see how you're settling in," she promised, though we both understood that tonight's call would become this weekend's call, which would become next week's call, until my presence in her life diminished to whatever level felt manageable for her. After she left, I sat in my new apartment and tried to understand how I'd gotten here. 3 years ago, Sarah had been desperate for my help. 2 years ago, she'd been grateful for my presence. 1 year ago, she'd started making casual comments about independence and aging and the importance of people finding their own paths. I'd missed all the warning signs because I'd been too focused on being useful, too committed to proving my worth through service, too afraid of being unwanted to recognize that I'd already become unwanted. I just hadn't been officially notified yet. The realization hit me like cold water. I'd been auditioning for a role in my daughter's life instead of simply living it, performing gratitude and helpfulness and minimal inconvenience in hopes of earning permanent membership in a family that was already complete without me. That night, surrounded by boxes I hadn't yet found the energy to unpack, I made a decision that surprised me with its clarity. I called Margaret. "I've been thinking about Phoenix," I said when she answered. And maybe it's time I stopped trying to be who other people need me to be and started figuring out who I actually am. Margaret's laugh carried joy and relief in equal measure. "It's about damn time, sister. When do you want me to book your flight?" Phoenix felt like stepping into a different version of my life, one where the air was dry and clean and didn't carry the weight of other people's expectations. Margaret's house sat in a neighborhood where retirees walked their dogs in the early morning coolness, and the pace of life moved according to personal preference rather than corporate demands or family obligations. For the first 2 weeks, I felt like I was playing house in someone else's reality. Margaret's guest room had windows that faced east, filling the space with sunrise light that felt like daily permission to start over. Her kitchen smelled of coffee and cinnamon rolls instead of the underlying anxiety that had permeated Sarah's house during those final months when my presence had become increasingly unwelcome. But Phoenix also meant distance from Emma, and that distance felt like a physical ache that settled in my chest and refused to leave. I'd gone from seeing my granddaughter every day to having no idea what she was doing, how she was adjusting to my absence, whether she still asked about the grandmother who'd simply vanished from her daily routine. Sarah called exactly twice during those first 2 weeks. The conversations followed the same script both times: bright, artificial inquiries about my adjustment, and enthusiastic reports about how well Emma was coping with the transition. As if my removal from her life was a natural developmental milestone, rather than an arbitrary loss inflicted by adults who'd prioritize their own comfort over a child's emotional security. "She's doing wonderfully in school," Sarah reported during the second call, her voice carrying the forced cheer of someone reading from prepared notes. "Her teacher says she's very resilient." Resilient. 7-year-olds shouldn't need to be resilient about losing their grandmothers. They should be building memories and learning recipes and hearing stories about family history from people who have time to sit still long enough to share wisdom. But I was learning that adults were remarkably skilled at reframing cruelty as character building, at convincing themselves that the pain they inflicted on children was somehow beneficial in the long run. "How are her mornings?" I asked, remembering the elaborate breakfast routines we'd developed together, the way Emma liked her pancakes cut into heart shapes and her orange juice in the blue cup with the chip on the handle. "Oh, much easier now," Sarah said quickly. "We've streamlined everything. She has cereal or toast and we're out the door by 7:30. So much more efficient." Efficient. My granddaughter's mornings had been reduced to efficiency rather than connection, speed rather than comfort, management rather than care, The woman who used to call me crying because she couldn't handle Emma's bedtime resistance had apparently discovered that parenting became simpler when you eliminated anything that required patience or creativity. I wanted to ask about Emma's nightmares, the ones that had started after a difficult day at school and had required weeks of gentle reassurance and extra bedtime stories to resolve. I wanted to ask about her art projects, whether she was still drawing pictures of houses with families in front of them. I wanted to ask whether she'd mentioned me at all, whether my absence had been explained in any way that made sense to a child's understanding of love and permanence. But Sarah's tone made it clear that such questions would be unwelcome, that my curiosity about Emma's adjustment would be interpreted as criticism of their new routine, interference with the streamlined family dynamic they'd created by eliminating my complicating presence. The third week in Phoenix, I made the mistake of calling on a Sunday evening, hoping to catch Emma before her bedtime. Sarah answered on the first ring, her voice immediately tense in a way that told me she'd been expecting this call and dreading it. "Mom, this really isn't a good time," she said, before I'd even finished saying hello. "Emma's having a friend over for a sleepover and things are pretty chaotic here." A sleepover. Emma was having new experiences, building new memories, creating the kind of childhood moments I'd imagined being part of for years to come. While I sat in Margaret's guest room, she was laughing with friends and eating pizza and staying up past her bedtime in the house where I was no longer welcome. "Could I just say hello quickly?" I asked, hating the pleading note that had crept into my voice. I haven't talked to her since I moved. The pause stretched long enough for me to understand that Sarah was calculating the potential complications of allowing this contact, weighing Emma's possible emotional response against the inconvenience of managing a child who might become upset about her grandmother's absence. "She's really busy with her friend right now," Sarah said finally. "Maybe another time." Another time. The phrase that people use when they mean never, but don't want to deal with the immediate emotional consequences of honesty. I hung up feeling smaller than I had in weeks, diminished by the realization that my granddaughter's life was continuing without me in ways that apparently didn't include even brief phone conversations. Emma was being trained to forget me through the simple expedient of making my existence irrelevant to her daily experience. That night, I sat in Margaret's backyard and watched the Arizona stars appear in a sky that was clearer than anything I'd seen in years of living in suburban developments where light pollution washed out half the universe. The silence felt different than the institutional quiet of Sunset Manor or the anxious hush of Sarah's house during those final months. This was the silence of possibility rather than limitation, space rather than confinement. But it was also lonely in ways I hadn't anticipated. Margaret worked part-time at a local art gallery and spent her evenings with a book club and a hiking group, and the kinds of social connections that people build when they have the time and energy to invest in relationships based on mutual interest rather than family obligation. I was proud of her for creating this life after David's death 3 years earlier. Proud of the way she'd transformed grief into growth and built something meaningful out of what could have been just survival. But her contentment also highlighted my own lack of identity outside my role as Sarah's mother and Emma's grandmother. Who was I when I wasn't needed? What did I want when no one else's preferences required accommodation? What brought me joy when I didn't have to filter every choice through someone else's convenience or comfort? At 58, I was discovering that I didn't know the answers to these fundamental questions. I'd spent so many years defining myself through service that I'd never developed the kind of internal compass that might guide me toward independent fulfillment. The fourth week brought a call that I'd been both hoping for and dreading. Sarah's voice carried a note of crisis that immediately transported me back to the years when her problems had been my emergencies, when her struggles had required my immediate attention and solutions. "Mom, I need to ask you something," she said without preamble. "Mark's company is sending him to Singapore for 6 weeks, and my biggest client just listed 3 properties that need constant showing. Emma's fall break is next week, and my regular babysitter is visiting her family in Colorado." I waited, understanding that Sarah was building toward a request that would reveal the selective nature of her concerns about my health risks and my disrupting influence on their family dynamics. "I know things have been complicated between us," Sarah continued, "but I wondered if you might consider coming back for the week, just temporarily, to help with Emma while I handle these showings." Temporarily. The same word she'd used 3 years ago when she'd convinced me to uproot my life and move in to help with Emma's care. The same promise of limited commitment that had stretched into years of unpaid domestic labor, followed by unceremonious dismissal when my usefulness expired. Now my cough was apparently manageable for a week when Sarah needed something, my presence acceptable when the alternatives were more expensive or less convenient than tolerating the health risks she'd claimed made my permanent residence impossible. "I see," I said slowly, buying time to process the magnitude of what Sarah was revealing about her actual priorities. "So my cough isn't dangerous when you need childcare, just when you don't." "Mom, that's not fair," Sarah protested, her voice taking on the wounded tone she'd perfected in adolescence when confronted with the consequences of her choices. "The situation has changed. Mark will be gone, so Emma won't be exposed to 2 potential sources of illness. And it's only for a week. Only for a week." As if the duration somehow transformed the fundamental dishonesty of her position. As if temporary need justified the abandonment I'd experienced when permanent help was no longer required. "What about Mrs. Henderson?" I asked. "I'm sure she'd be happy to supervise Emma for a week." Sarah's hesitation revealed the truth she didn't want to state directly, that supervision wasn't the same as care, that Emma needed more than someone to ensure her physical safety while Sarah pursued her career ambitions. "Mrs. Henderson doesn't really connect with Emma the way you do," Sarah admitted. "Emma's been having some trouble sleeping lately, and she doesn't eat well when I'm working late. She needs someone who understands her routine. Someone who understands her routine. Someone who knew which stories calmed her nighttime anxiety and which foods she'd eat when stress affected her appetite. Someone who'd invested years in learning the subtle signs of her emotional needs and developing the patient responses that helped her navigate difficult feelings. Someone like the grandmother who'd been discarded when convenience demanded it, but was now being summoned back when necessity required it. "I'm in Phoenix now, Sarah," I said quietly. "I've started building a life here. I know, and I'm sorry to ask, but Emma really needs you right now. And I don't have anyone else I can trust with her for a whole week. Emma really needs you." The words I'd been longing to hear for a month, the acknowledgement that my presence mattered in ways that went beyond convenience or obligation. But they came wrapped in the same temporary framework that had defined my relationship with Sarah's family from the beginning: needed when useful, dismissed when not. I thought about Emma struggling with sleep, eating meals that didn't bring comfort, facing a week without either parent fully available, while Sarah juggled career demands that apparently mattered more than providing stability during her daughter's school break. I thought about Margaret's offer of permanence and acceptance, about the Arizona sunsets I was just beginning to appreciate, about the possibility of building something that belonged to me rather than constantly trying to earn my place in other people's lives. And I thought about my granddaughter, 7 years old, and learning that the adults in her life appeared and disappeared according to complicated rules that had nothing to do with love and everything to do with convenience. "I'll think about it," I told Sarah, though we both understood that thinking about it meant yes. Despite everything she'd done, despite the way she'd treated me, despite the clear evidence that I would be discarded again as soon as her crisis passed, I couldn't abandon Emma when she needed me. But this time would be different. This time, I had somewhere to return to when the week ended. This time, I wouldn't be auditioning for permanent acceptance. This time, I would help because I chose to, not because I was desperate to prove my worth. After I hung up, I sat in Margaret's kitchen and finally understood the pattern that had defined my relationship with Sarah for 3 years. I wasn't family. I was a resource to be utilized when necessary and stored when not needed, like emergency supplies kept in a closet until crisis required their deployment. The realization should have been devastating. Instead, it felt oddly liberating, because now I knew exactly what I was dealing with, and knowledge, even painful knowledge, was better than hope built on illusions. But I still had something Sarah didn't know about, something that would change everything. The flight back to Denver felt different than my previous trips between Arizona and Colorado. This time, I wasn't returning as a displaced person seeking readmission to a family that had rejected me. I was returning as someone with options, someone who had experienced what it felt like to be wanted rather than merely tolerated. Margaret had driven me to the airport with the confidence of someone who knew I'd be back, who understood that this week with Sarah and Emma was a choice rather than a desperate attempt to reclaim lost belonging. "Remember," she'd said as I collected my small suitcase from her trunk, "you're not auditioning anymore. You're helping someone who needs help, and then you're coming home." Home. Phoenix had become home in 5 weeks, while Sarah's house had never felt like home even during 3 years of residence. The difference, I realized, was the presence or absence of conditions attached to my welcome. Sarah met me at the airport with Emma, who launched herself into my arms with the kind of unrestrained joy that reminded me why I'd agreed to come back. Her small body felt thinner than I remembered, her embrace more desperate, as if she'd been storing up affection during the weeks of my absence. "Grandma, you came back!" Emma's voice carried relief mixed with surprise, as if my return was too good to be true, too wonderful to trust completely. "Of course I came back," I told her, breathing in the familiar scent of her hair and feeling something inside my chest unlock for the first time in weeks. I promised I would. Sarah watched our reunion with the awkward smile of someone who understood that she'd created the separation that made this reunion necessary, who recognized the irony of facilitating a connection she'd previously deemed too dangerous to maintain. The drive to Sarah's house revealed changes that spoke to Emma's struggles during my absence. Sarah looked thinner, too, her professional composure slightly frayed around the edges, her usual conversational confidence replaced by the rambling chatter of someone trying to fill uncomfortable silences. "Emma's been so excited about you coming," Sarah said, glancing at me in the rearview mirror while Emma held my hand with both of hers. "She's been planning activities for you two all week." Activities. As if my relationship with Emma had been reduced to entertainment, rather than the daily care and attention that had defined our bond before Sarah's housekeeping exercise had separated us. "We're going to make cookies," Emma announced with the kind of determination that suggested this plan had been carefully considered and extensively discussed. "The kind with chocolate chips that you taught me about." The kind with chocolate chips that I'd taught her about during dozens of afternoon baking sessions, when we'd measured ingredients together and talked about everything from school friendships to the way yeast made bread rise. Moments of connection that Sarah had apparently decided were less important than the perceived risks of my respiratory condition. "That sounds perfect," I said, though I noticed Sarah's slight wince at the mention of baking, the way her hands tightened on the steering wheel at the prospect of flour scattered across her pristine countertops and mixing bowls left in the sink. The house looked the same from the outside, but stepping through the front door revealed the subtle signs of a family system under stress. Emma's backpack and school papers were scattered across the living room instead of organized in the mudroom cubby I'd maintained. Dishes sat in the sink despite the dishwasher's proximity. Laundry waited in baskets that suggested Sarah had been managing washing but not folding, cleaning but not organizing. These weren't criticisms. They were evidence of a working mother trying to handle responsibilities that had previously been shared. Proof that my contributions had been more substantial than Sarah had acknowledged when she'd decided my presence was no longer worth the complications it allegedly created. "I've got showings lined up all week," Sarah explained as she hefted my suitcase up the stairs to the guest room that had briefly been my bedroom, before becoming storage space for seasonal decorations and exercise equipment Sarah never used. "Some of them in the evenings, so Emma will need dinner and homework help." Dinner and homework help. The same responsibilities I'd handled for 3 years, now presented as temporary favors rather than acknowledged contributions to their family's functioning. "The Hendersons offered to help if you need anything," Sarah continued, though we both understood that Mrs. Henderson's help consisted mainly of surveillance and judgment, rather than actual childcare. "And Emma knows she's supposed to be extra good this week." Extra good. As if my granddaughter's normal behavior required improvement, as if the natural energy and curiosity of a 7-year-old was a burden to be managed rather than a joy to be celebrated. That first afternoon, while Sarah rushed off to meet clients and discuss property values that apparently mattered more than family stability, Emma and I settled into the kitchen for the cookie-making session that had sustained her through weeks of my absence. But something had changed in Emma during those weeks. She was quieter than I remembered, more cautious, as if she'd learned that expressing needs or preferences might result in additional losses. She measured ingredients with unusual precision, as if following rules exactly might prevent future disappointments. "Grandma, she said while we waited for the first batch to bake, her voice carrying the careful tone of someone testing dangerous waters. "Are you going to stay this time?" The question broke my heart with its innocent directness. Its assumption that my previous departure had been a choice rather than an eviction. How do you explain to a 7-year-old that adults make decisions based on fear and convenience rather than love and loyalty? "I'm here for this week," I said carefully. "And then I'm going back to Arizona where Aunt Margaret lives." "But why?" Emma's eyes filled with tears she'd apparently been holding back for weeks. "Why can't you just live here like before?" Before. When I'd been useful enough to offset the inconvenience of my presence, when their need for childcare had outweighed their concerns about my health risks, when I'd been too grateful for inclusion to recognize that I was being used rather than valued. "Sometimes adults make decisions that don't make sense to little girls," I said, echoing words I'd spoken during those awful final days. "But that doesn't mean anything about how much we love each other." Emma nodded with the false understanding of a child who'd learned to accept explanations that explained nothing, who'd been trained to suppress questions that adults found uncomfortable. We spent that week rebuilding the connection that Sarah's decision had interrupted. I read Emma bedtime stories and listened to her detailed accounts of playground politics. I helped with homework and packed lunches and provided the kind of patient attention that exhausted working parents rarely have energy to sustain. But I also watched. I paid attention to the patterns that had been invisible during my previous residence, when I'd been too focused on being helpful to recognize the dysfunction I was enabling. Sarah came home each evening with updates about her showings and sales prospects, treating Emma and me like an efficient childcare service that required minimal acknowledgement. She ate the dinners I prepared without commenting on the effort involved, accepted Emma's calm bedtime routine without recognizing the work that went into creating it. On Thursday evening, while Sarah attended a client dinner that ran past 10 o'clock, Emma had one of her nightmares, the kind that had occasionally disrupted her sleep during my previous residence. She woke up crying, disoriented and frightened by dreams she couldn't fully explain. I sat with her until she calmed down, stroking her hair and humming the lullabies that had worked when she was younger. Gradually, her breathing slowed, and her grip on my hand relaxed as she drifted back toward sleep. "Grandma," she whispered just as I thought she'd settled. "Yes, sweetheart. I missed you so much it made my stomach hurt." Her words carried the kind of honest pain that adults learn to disguise, but children haven't yet been taught to hide. She'd been grieving my absence in the direct, uncomplicated way that children grieve losses they don't understand and can't control. "I missed you too," I told her truthfully. "More than I can explain. When you go back to Arizona, will you forget about me?" The question revealed the fear that had been growing during weeks of my absence, the child's logic that suggested love might be conditional on proximity, that distance might erode the bonds that had felt permanent and secure. "Never," I said with absolute certainty. "I could never forget about you. You're written on my heart in permanent ink." She giggled at that image, as I'd hoped she would. "Permanent ink? Like tattoos?" "Exactly like tattoos. You're part of me forever, no matter where I live or how far away I am." Friday morning brought Sarah's return from her business trip preparation and the kind of casual dismissal I'd learned to expect. She thanked me for helping out, as if I'd done her a favor rather than providing professional quality childcare for a week, while she pursued career opportunities that wouldn't have been possible without my support. "Emma seems much more settled," Sarah observed, as if my granddaughter's improved mood was a surprising development rather than the predictable result of consistent, loving attention from someone who understood her needs. "She missed having routine," I said carefully, though what I meant was that Emma had missed having someone who prioritized her emotional well-being over everything else. "Well, hopefully things will get back to normal now," Sarah replied, though we both understood that normal meant Emma adjusting to whatever schedule worked for Sarah's career ambitions, regardless of what worked for a 7-year-old's developmental needs. That afternoon, while Emma was at school and Sarah was showing properties to potential buyers, I made a decision that had been forming throughout the week. I called my lawyer. Richard Pemberton had handled my divorce 20 years earlier and had occasionally assisted with other legal matters over the years. He was approaching retirement himself, a man who understood that legal expertise sometimes involved more than just technical knowledge. "Evelyn," he said when his secretary put me through. "It's good to hear from you. How are things in Phoenix?" "Actually, I'm in Denver this week," I explained, "and I need some advice about something that's been weighing on my mind." I told him about the situation with Sarah and Emma, about the pattern of conditional acceptance and arbitrary dismissal, about the way my granddaughter was being hurt by adult decisions that prioritized convenience over stability. "What are my rights regarding Emma?" I asked finally. "Not legally, necessarily, but practically. What options do I have?" Richard was quiet for a moment, the kind of thoughtful silence that suggested he was considering not just legal precedents, but human realities. "Grandparents' rights are complicated," he said finally, "but there are some things you should know, some things that might change how you approach this situation." He explained that in cases where grandparents had provided substantial care for extended periods, courts sometimes recognized the importance of maintaining those relationships, especially when interrupting them caused documented harm to the children involved. "You said you lived with them for 3 years?" he asked. "Providing daily care while they both worked?" "Yes. I was Emma's primary caregiver after school and during summers, plus household management and meal preparation. And they asked you to leave because of health concerns that don't actually affect your ability to provide care?" "Sarah was worried about my cough, but it's a chronic condition I've had for 20 years. It's not contagious or progressive." "Evelyn," Richard said carefully, "I think there are some things you need to know about your position, things that might surprise you." He spent the next 20 minutes explaining legal concepts I'd never considered, rights I'd never known I possessed, options I'd never imagined were available. By the time I hung up, I understood that my situation was very different than I'd believed. Sarah didn't know it yet, but her pattern of using and discarding me had created a legal framework that might work in my favor rather than hers. It wasn't anger driving me anymore. It was clarity. And sometimes clarity is more powerful than anger, because clarity knows exactly what it wants to accomplish. My last morning in Sarah's house dawned with the kind of crystalline clarity that makes everything look sharper, more defined. I woke before the alarm, not from anxiety, but from the quiet alertness that comes when you know something important is about to happen. Emma was still sleeping in her bed, one arm thrown over the stuffed rabbit I'd given her for her 5th birthday, her face peaceful in a way that reminded me of the toddler she'd been when I first moved in to help Sarah manage the impossible balance of career and motherhood. Looking at her, I felt the weight of what Richard had explained to me during our phone conversation. In legal terms, I'd been what courts called a de facto parent, someone who'd provided substantial care over an extended period, someone whose relationship with a child was significant enough to warrant protection under certain circumstances. 3 years of daily care, 3 years of being Emma's primary caregiver after school and during summers, 3 years of school pickups and doctor appointments, and midnight comfort during bad dreams. 3 years of building the kind of bond that family courts sometimes recognized as worthy of preservation, regardless of biological relationships or property ownership. Sarah didn't know any of this, of course. She'd made her decisions about my place in Emma's life based on the assumption that her authority as a biological parent was absolute, that her convenience as an adult took precedence over Emma's emotional needs as a child, that grandparents existed at the pleasure of their adult children rather than having any independent standing in their grandchildren's lives. She was about to learn differently, but first, I had preparations to make. I'd spent the week documenting everything with the quiet thoroughness that Richard had suggested. Photos of Emma's homework that I'd helped with, showing the improvement in her grades when she had consistent academic support. Screenshots of the school's automated messages about her improved attendance and behavior during the week I'd been providing care. Notes about her eating and sleeping patterns, her emotional responses, her requests for stories and comfort that revealed the depth of our connection. I'd also been observing Sarah with new eyes, seeing patterns that I'd previously dismissed as normal working parent stress, but now recognized as something more problematic. The way she delegated Emma's emotional needs to whoever was available, rather than prioritizing them herself. The way she discussed Emma's schedule and preferences as inconveniences to be managed, rather than needs to be met. The way she'd trained Emma to suppress requests for attention or affection that interfered with adult priorities. None of it was intentionally cruel. Sarah loved Emma in her own way. the way busy professionals love their children, as precious but challenging responsibilities that required efficient management rather than patient nurturing. But love without availability, affection without attention, wasn't enough to meet a 7-year-old's developmental needs. Emma needed what I'd been providing: consistent presence, patient listening, the kind of emotional attunement that helped children feel secure and valued. She needed someone who prioritized her feelings over efficiency, her questions over convenience, her need for connection over adult productivity. Sarah couldn't provide those things, not because she was a bad person, but because she'd built a life that left no room for the time-intensive work of child rearing. Her career demands, her social obligations, her relationship with Mark. Everything took precedence over the slow, patient work of raising a child who felt loved rather than managed. Saturday morning arrived with the institutional efficiency I'd learned to expect from Sarah's household management. She appeared in the kitchen at exactly 8 o'clock, dressed for her weekend showings, already mentally organizing her day around client needs and commission opportunities. "The Hendersons said they'd check on Emma if she needs anything," Sarah said, pouring coffee into a travel mug that bore the logo of her real estate company. "Though she should be fine. She knows the rules about not answering the door and not using the stove. Rules for a 7-year-old to follow while spending Saturday alone, because her mother's career couldn't accommodate the inconvenience of child-centered scheduling, and she'd rejected the grandmother who would have happily provided care." "How long will you be gone?" I asked, though I was really wondering how many hours Emma would spend alone in this house, entertaining herself while waiting for adults to finish their more important activities. "Hard to say. These clients are relocating from California, so if they're serious about buying, I might need to show them multiple properties. Could be all day." All day. Emma would spend her Saturday alone while Sarah pursued potential sales that might or might not materialize because 7-year-olds were expected to accommodate adult schedules rather than the other way around. "I could stay a few extra hours," I offered, testing something. "Keep Emma company until you get back." Sarah's immediate tension revealed everything I needed to know about her actual priorities. "That's really not necessary, Mom. Emma's fine on her own for a few hours. She's very independent." Independent. 7-year-old children weren't supposed to be independent. They were supposed to be cared for, supervised, engaged with activities that supported their development rather than left to manage their own entertainment and safety. "Besides," Sarah continued, "your flight leaves at 4, and you'll need time to get through security." My flight, that she'd booked without consulting me about timing or preferences, scheduled to remove me from Emma's life with the same efficiency she applied to property transactions. After Sarah left, Emma and I had our final morning together. We made pancakes shaped like hearts and talked about the week we'd shared, the games we'd played, the stories we'd read together. But underneath our conversation, I could feel Emma's growing anxiety about my departure. The way she kept checking the clock and asking how much time we had left. "Will you call me from Arizona?" she asked while we cleaned up the breakfast dishes. "Every week," I promised. "And I'll send you letters too. Real letters that come in the mailbox." Her eyes brightened at that prospect. "With stickers?" "With stickers," I confirmed, remembering how much she'd always loved the small decorative touches that made ordinary things feel special. At noon, I called a taxi instead of the rideshare Sarah had arranged. I needed to control my own timing for what came next. "Grandma, don't go yet," Emma said as I collected my suitcase from the guest room. "Can't you stay just a little longer?" The plea broke my heart, but it also strengthened my resolve. This child shouldn't have to beg for time with someone who loved her, shouldn't have to watch the adults in her life prioritize everything else over her emotional security. "I have to go today, sweetheart," I said, hugging her close. "But this isn't goodbye forever. You're going to see me again sooner than you think." Something in my tone must have conveyed more certainty than she'd expected, because she pulled back to look at my face with the kind of searching attention that children use when they sense adult secrets. "Promise?" she asked. "Promise," I said, and meant it completely. The taxi arrived precisely on schedule, but instead of going directly to the airport, I asked the driver to make a stop at the office building where Richard Pemberton practiced law. I'd called him Friday evening to arrange a Saturday meeting, explaining that timing was crucial for what I wanted to accomplish. Richard's office occupied the corner of a building that had seen better decades, with windows that looked out on the kind of downtown Denver architecture that mixed historical charm with practical functionality. The waiting room featured furniture that was comfortable without being luxurious, magazines that were current without being trendy, and the kind of neutral decor that suggested competence rather than ostentation. "Evelyn," Richard said when his secretary showed me into his office, "I've been thinking about our conversation all week. Are you sure you want to proceed with this?" "I'm sure," I said, settling into the chair across from his desk. "Emma needs protection that she's not getting, and I'm the only one positioned to provide it." He nodded slowly, understanding that this wasn't about my hurt feelings or Sarah's thoughtlessness, but about a child's welfare and a grandmother's legal rights to maintain a relationship that served the child's best interests. "I've prepared the preliminary paperwork," he said, sliding a folder across his desk. "Petition for grandparent visitation rights, citing your established relationship with Emma and the potential harm to her emotional development if that relationship is arbitrarily terminated. Grandparent visitation rights." I'd never known such things existed, had never imagined that courts might intervene when families broke apart due to adult selfishness, rather than actual child welfare concerns. "What happens next?" I asked, though part of me already knew from our previous conversation. "We file the petition on Monday morning," Richard explained. "Sarah will be served with papers within 48 hours, requiring her to appear in court and explain why terminating your relationship with Emma serves Emma's best interests, rather than just Sarah's preferences." Served with papers. Sarah, who thought she'd efficiently resolved the inconvenience of my presence, would discover that legal systems sometimes protected children's relationships with caring adults, regardless of biological parents' convenience preferences. "The burden of proof will be on her," Richard continued, "to demonstrate that your presence in Emma's life creates actual harm, rather than just theoretical concerns about respiratory conditions that haven't affected your caregiving ability in 20 years. I thought about the week I'd just spent with Emma, the documented improvement in her eating and sleeping and emotional stability when she had consistent care from someone who prioritized her needs over everything else. "How long does this process take?" I asked. "Usually several weeks to get a hearing date, but given Emma's age and the school schedule, courts often expedite these cases, probably within a month." A month. Sarah would spend the next month discovering that discarding family members wasn't as simple as she'd assumed, that children's rights sometimes trumped parents' preferences, that courts could order relationships to continue when those relationships served children's best interests. I signed the papers with hands that were steady, despite the magnitude of what I was setting in motion. This wasn't revenge. It was protection. Not punishment for Sarah, but security for Emma. Not anger-driving action, but love demanding justice. "There's one more thing," Richard said as I prepared to leave. "The court will likely require a social services evaluation of Emma's current living situation and your relationship with her. Someone will interview all of you separately and observe your interactions together. A social services evaluation. Professionals would assess whether Emma was thriving under Sarah's management-focused parenting or whether she needed the kind of consistent emotional support I'd been providing. I thought about Emma's nightmares, her careful behavior designed to avoid causing inconvenience, her questions about whether I would forget her. I thought about Sarah's efficient scheduling that left no room for childhood needs that couldn't be managed with rules and routines. "I'm not worried about that evaluation," I said truthfully. Richard smiled for the first time since I'd arrived. "I didn't think you would be." The taxi to the airport felt like the conclusion of one chapter and the beginning of another. I wasn't fleeing Sarah's rejection anymore. I was returning to Phoenix to wait for the legal system to recognize what I already knew. Emma deserved better than efficient management disguised as parenting. She deserved the kind of love that showed up consistently, that prioritized her emotional security over adult convenience, that recognized her needs as valid rather than negotiable. And I was going to make sure she got it. Sarah still thought she'd won by removing the inconvenience of my presence from her perfectly organized life. She had no idea that her efficiency was about to collide with Emma's legal rights and my grandmother's determination to protect them. Tuesday afternoon in Phoenix, I was helping Margaret plant winter vegetables in her backyard garden when my phone rang with Sarah's number. 3 days had passed since the legal papers were served, 3 days during which Sarah had apparently been processing the reality that her efficient disposal of inconvenient family members had collided with legal systems designed to protect children's relationships with caring adults. Margaret looked up from the tomato seedlings we'd been transplanting, soil dark under her fingernails, understanding immediately from my expression that this was the call we'd been expecting. "Let me guess," she said dryly. "Your daughter has discovered that discarding family members isn't as simple as she thought." I answered on the fourth ring, not from uncertainty, but because I wanted to control the rhythm of this conversation from the beginning. Sarah's voice, when it came through the speaker, carried a tone I'd never heard before, panic mixed with indignation, the sound of someone whose carefully constructed world had been disrupted by consequences they'd never considered. "Mom, what the hell is this?" Sarah's voice was sharp, with an anger that seemed to assume I would immediately apologize and explain how to make this legal inconvenience disappear. "I just got served with papers saying you're suing for visitation rights. How could you do this to us?" Us. As if Emma wasn't part of the us whose interests I was trying to protect. As if this legal action was about punishing Sarah rather than ensuring a 7-year-old had access to the grandmother who'd been her primary caregiver for 3 years. "I filed a petition for grandparent visitation," I said calmly, brushing dirt from my hands while I spoke. "Because Emma needs consistency and support that she's not getting." "She's getting plenty of support," Sarah snapped, her voice rising to the pitch she used when defending decisions she wasn't entirely confident about. "I'm her mother. I know what's best for my daughter. Best for her daughter. Like leaving Emma alone for 8 hours on Saturday while pursuing real estate commissions. Like denying her the relationship with the grandmother who'd helped raise her. Like prioritizing adult convenience over a child's emotional security." "Do you?" I asked quietly, because the social worker who'll be evaluating Emma's situation might have questions about that. The silence that followed was long enough for me to understand that Sarah was processing implications she'd never considered. She'd assumed that legal systems would automatically defer to biological parents' preferences, that her authority over Emma's relationships was absolute and unquestionable. "Social worker?" Sarah's voice had dropped to a whisper, the panic now outweighing the indignation. "What social worker?" "The one the court appoints to evaluate whether Emma's current living situation serves her best interests," I explained patiently. "They'll want to understand why you believe terminating her relationship with me benefits her development rather than just making your life more convenient." Margaret had stopped pretending to garden and was watching this conversation with the fascination of someone witnessing justice finally assert itself after weeks of watching injustice flourish unchallenged. "This is ridiculous," Sarah said, but her voice now carried the uncertainty of someone who was beginning to understand that ridiculous or not, it was also real and happening, and beyond her control. "You can't just sue for access to someone else's child." Someone else's child. Emma, who'd run to me for comfort when she scraped her knees, who'd asked me to braid her hair because I was better at it than Mommy, who'd fallen asleep in my lap during countless Sunday afternoon movies, was being described as someone else's child by the daughter I'd raised and supported through every crisis of her adult life. "Emma isn't someone else's child," I said, with the kind of quiet firmness that I'd learned from Margaret during our conversations about family dynamics and personal boundaries. "She's my granddaughter, whom I helped raise for 3 years, whom I love unconditionally, and whom the state recognizes as having a relationship with me that might be worth protecting." "The state?" Sarah's voice cracked slightly on the words. "What do you mean the state recognizes?" "Colorado law acknowledges that grandparents who've provided substantial care over extended periods have legal standing to petition for continued contact when that contact serves the child's best interests," I explained, quoting language Richard had taught me during our preparation sessions. What I didn't tell Sarah was that Richard had spent the previous week researching precedents and had found several cases where courts had ruled in favor of grandparents in situations remarkably similar to ours. Cases where biological parents had attempted to terminate relationships that served children's emotional needs, where efficiency and convenience had been weighed against stability and love, where legal systems had prioritized children's welfare over parents' preferences. "Mom, please." Sarah's voice shifted to a tone I recognized from her childhood, the pleading note she'd used when she'd made mistakes and wanted me to fix them without consequences. "Can't we work this out between ourselves? Do we really need to involve courts and social workers? Work this out between ourselves." The way we'd worked out my living situation when Sarah decided my presence was inconvenient? The way we'd worked out my access to Emma when Sarah determined that her career demands took precedence over a child's need for consistent care? We could have worked it out between ourselves, I agreed, if you'd been willing to consider Emma's needs alongside your preferences. If you'd recognized that throwing away family members isn't a solution to problems that require adult patience and commitment. The silence stretched long enough for me to understand that Sarah was calculating, trying to figure out how to regain control of a situation that had moved beyond her authority to manage through efficient decision-making. "What do you want?" she asked finally, her voice carrying the resignation of someone who'd realized that negotiation might be necessary. What did I want? I wanted Emma to feel secure in her relationships rather than constantly anxious about which adults would disappear next. I wanted her to have access to the grandmother who'd helped shape her understanding of love and stability. I wanted Sarah to recognize that parenting required more than efficient management, that children needed emotional attention as much as they needed rules and schedules. But mostly, I wanted Emma to grow up knowing that she was worth fighting for, that her emotional needs mattered enough for adults to prioritize them over convenience. "I want court-ordered visitation," I said clearly. 2 weekends a month, plus holidays and school breaks. I want Emma to have legal protection for our relationship, so it can't be terminated whenever you decide it's inconvenient. 2 weekends a month? Sarah's voice rose again. That's half her free time. Half her free time that Sarah had been filling with babysitters and neighbors and solitary entertainment while she pursued career opportunities that required Emma to accommodate adult schedules rather than having adult schedules accommodate childhood needs. It's half the time she would have spent with me anyway, when I was living there providing childcare that you needed, but apparently didn't value enough to treat with basic respect, I replied. Margaret gave me a thumbs up from across the garden, her approval obvious in the way she'd stopped pretending to work and was openly listening to my side of the conversation. "And if I refuse?" Sarah asked, though her tone suggested she already understood that refusal wasn't really an option anymore. "Then we go to court, and a judge decides based on Emma's best interests rather than your preferences," I said calmly. "And the social worker's evaluation will include Emma's emotional responses, her school performance, her behavior patterns when she has consistent care versus when she's left to manage herself." What I didn't mention was that Richard had also prepared documentation of Sarah's pattern of leaving Emma alone for extended periods, of delegating emotional support to whoever was available, of prioritizing career demands over parenting responsibilities in ways that might concern social services professionals. "The social worker will also want to understand," I continued, "why you believe a child's relationship with a loving grandmother who helped raise her creates more risk than benefit, especially when that grandmother's supposed health concerns didn't prevent you from requesting her care when you needed childcare for a week." That last point landed with particular force, because it highlighted the inconsistency in Sarah's position. My cough had been dangerous enough to justify exile from Emma's daily life, but manageable enough to accept when Sarah needed convenient babysitting. The silence that followed was different from Sarah's earlier pauses. This wasn't calculation. This was the sound of someone realizing that their position wouldn't hold up under scrutiny, that their justifications looked arbitrary and self-serving when examined by neutral professionals. "I need to talk to Mark," Sarah said finally, her voice deflated in a way that suggested she was beginning to understand that this situation had moved beyond her control. "That's fine," I said, "but the legal process doesn't wait for family conferences. The court date is set for 3 weeks from Friday. The social worker will be contacting you to schedule Emma's evaluation." 3 weeks? The panic was back in Sarah's voice. "That's so fast." "Courts prioritize cases involving children," I explained, "especially when those children's emotional welfare might be affected by ongoing uncertainty about their relationships with caring adults." After Sarah hung up, without saying goodbye, but also without the anger that had characterized the beginning of our conversation. Margaret and I sat in her garden and watched the Arizona sunset paint the sky in shades of pink and gold that I'd never seen during my years in Colorado. "How do you feel?" Margaret asked, her voice carrying the gentle concern of someone who understood that legal victories could feel complicated even when they were necessary. "Tired," I said honestly, "and sad that it came to this. But also relieved, I think. Emma deserves protection, and now she's going to get it." "Sarah sounded like she's beginning to understand that actions have consequences," Margaret observed, "even when those actions involve discarding family members who were inconvenient." That evening, my phone rang again. This time, it was Emma calling from Sarah's phone, her 7-year-old voice bright with excitement and hope. "Grandma, Mommy says you might be coming to visit again soon." The joy in her voice confirmed everything I'd known about the necessity of this legal action. Emma needed the security of knowing that our relationship was protected, that she wouldn't wake up one morning to find that another caring adult had simply vanished from her life without explanation or recourse. "That's right, sweetheart," I said, smiling at Margaret across her living room. "We're going to make sure you and I get to spend lots of time together. Every weekend?" Emma's voice carried the kind of hope that children invest in possibilities that adults have taught them not to count on. "Not every weekend, but some weekends, and holidays, and summer vacation time. Forever and ever?" "Forever and ever," I confirmed, understanding that forever was exactly what court-ordered visitation would provide: legal permanence that couldn't be terminated by adult convenience or arbitrary decisions about health risks that had never actually existed. After Emma said goodnight, I sat in Margaret's kitchen and thought about the path that had brought me from Sarah's rejection to legal protection for my relationship with my granddaughter. I'd learned that sometimes the greatest act of love is refusing to accept unacceptable treatment, that protecting a child sometimes requires challenging the adults who claim to know what's best for her. Sarah still thought this was about my hurt feelings and wounded pride. She didn't understand yet that it was about Emma's rights and my determination to ensure she had access to the grandmother who loved her unconditionally, but she was about to learn. And so was the social worker, and the judge, and anyone else who needed to understand that children's emotional welfare sometimes requires legal protection from the very parents who are supposed to prioritize it above everything else. The courthouse in Denver was smaller than I'd expected, with the kind of worn dignity that comes from decades of people seeking justice in rooms designed to inspire respect rather than intimidation. Margaret had flown in from Phoenix to be with me, understanding that some moments in life require witnesses who love you unconditionally, regardless of the outcome. 3 weeks had passed since my phone conversation with Sarah, 3 weeks during which the social worker had conducted her evaluation and Richard had prepared our case with the thoroughness of someone who understood that children's welfare was too important for anything less than meticulous attention to detail. The social worker's report, which Richard had received copies of the previous day, painted a picture that confirmed everything I'd known about Emma's situation, but had never seen documented in official language. Emma showed signs of anxiety and attachment disruption following my removal from her daily routine. Her school performance had declined during the months of my absence and improved dramatically during the week I'd provided care. Her teacher had noted that she seemed more withdrawn and asked repeatedly about when her grandmother would return. Most tellingly, during the social worker's interview with Emma, conducted privately as required by law, my granddaughter had expressed confusion about why adults who loved each other had to live apart, and worry that other important people might disappear without warning from her life. Children need predictability in their relationships with caring adults, the social worker had written in her summary. Arbitrary termination of established bonds can create lasting anxiety and difficulty trusting that love is permanent rather than conditional. Sarah arrived at the courthouse 15 minutes before our scheduled hearing time, accompanied by Mark and a lawyer whose expensive suit suggested they'd invested significantly in legal representation. She looked thinner than she had 3 weeks earlier, her professional composure slightly frayed around the edges in a way that suggested the reality of legal scrutiny had been more stressful than she'd anticipated. Mark kept checking his phone and glancing at his watch with the impatience of someone who had more important places to be. though I wondered what could be more important than determining whether his stepdaughter would have legal protection for her relationship with the grandmother who'd helped raise her. Sarah's lawyer was a woman in her 40s, with the kind of confident bearing that comes from winning cases through aggressive advocacy rather than collaborative problem-solving. She approached Richard with the professional courtesy of someone preparing for battle rather than resolution. "Mrs. Morrison," Sarah's lawyer said, extending her hand to me with a smile that was pleasant without being warm. "I'm Amanda Chen, representing Sarah and Mark. I understand you're seeking visitation with your granddaughter." Seeking visitation. As if I were a stranger requesting access to a child, rather than the grandmother who'd provided 3 years of daily care before being expelled for the crime of having a respiratory condition that had never affected my ability to provide love and support. "I'm seeking legal protection for Emma's relationship with me," I corrected gently. "The relationship she's always had until it was arbitrarily terminated." Judge Patricia Hernandez entered the courtroom with the kind of measured dignity that suggested decades of experience with family disputes that brought out both the best and worst in human nature. She was younger than I'd expected, probably in her early 50s, with graying hair and the careful attention to detail that family court judges develop when they understand that their decisions affect children's lives in permanent ways. "This is a petition for grandparent visitation filed by Evelyn Morrison," Judge Hernandez said, reviewing the papers on her desk. "Mrs. Morrison is seeking court-ordered visitation with her granddaughter, Emma Davidson, age 7. The respondents are Sarah Davidson, Emma's mother, and Mark Davidson, Emma's stepfather." The formal language transformed our family dysfunction into legal procedure, reducing months of emotional manipulation and arbitrary exile to questions of law and evidence, and what served Emma's best interests rather than what was most convenient for the adults in her life. Richard presented our case with the quiet competence I'd learned to appreciate during our preparation sessions. He documented my 3 years of providing daily care, my contribution to Emma's emotional and academic development, the improvement in her behavior and school performance when I was present versus the decline when I was absent. "Mrs. Morrison served as Emma's primary after-school caregiver," Richard explained to Judge Hernandez, "providing homework assistance, meal preparation, transportation to activities, and emotional support that enabled both parents to maintain demanding work schedules. The termination of this relationship was not based on any failure to provide adequate care or any behavior that endangered Emma's welfare." He then introduced evidence that Sarah's lawyer had apparently not anticipated: documentation of Emma's emotional responses during the social worker's evaluation, her teacher's observations about behavioral changes, and most damaging to Sarah's position, evidence of the occasions when she'd left Emma alone for extended periods rather than arranging adequate supervision. The respondent's decision to terminate this relationship appears to have been based on concerns about Mrs. Morrison's respiratory condition, Richard continued. Yet she subsequently requested Mrs. Morrison's care for a full week when it was convenient for her schedule. This suggests that health concerns were pretextual rather than genuine. Amanda Chen's response was more aggressive than persuasive, focusing on parental rights and the biological mother's authority to make decisions about her child's relationships. She presented Sarah as a responsible single mother who'd made difficult decisions based on legitimate concerns about health risks and family dynamics. But when Judge Hernandez asked for specific examples of harm caused by my presence in Emma's life, Amanda Chen's response revealed the weakness of their position. She cited theoretical risks from my respiratory condition, disruption to family routines, and the importance of Emma learning independence appropriate to her age. Theoretical risks. Disruption to routines. Age-appropriate independence. Nothing about Emma's actual welfare, her emotional needs, her attachment to the grandmother who'd helped raise her. Nothing about whether she was thriving under the efficient management that had replaced patient care, whether she felt secure in relationships that could be terminated without her input or consideration of her feelings. "Mrs. Davidson," Judge Hernandez said, addressing Sarah directly, "can you explain why maintaining Emma's relationship with her grandmother is not in Emma's best interests?" Sarah stood with the careful posture she used during real estate presentations, her professional persona intact, but clearly strained by the unfamiliar environment of legal accountability. "Your Honor, I love my mother. Sarah began, her voice carrying practiced sincerity. But Emma needs to learn that she can't always depend on other people to solve her problems. Having my mother there all the time was making Emma too dependent, less resilient. Sarah was describing love and support as character weaknesses, suggesting that Emma needed less attention rather than more, that a 7-year-old should be developing independence by being denied access to caring adults who prioritized her emotional welfare. And the health concerns? Judge Hernandez asked. Sarah's hesitation lasted just long enough to reveal her uncertainty. My mother has a chronic cough that could potentially expose Emma to respiratory illness. Yet you requested her care for a week in October, Judge Hernandez observed, consulting the documentation Richard had provided. Were you not concerned about Emma's health during that period? The question hung in the courtroom like an accusation, highlighting the inconsistency that undermined Sarah's entire position. Either my cough was dangerous enough to justify cutting off Emma's relationship with me, or it wasn't. Sarah couldn't claim both positions depending on her convenience. That was temporary, Sarah said weakly. Emergency childcare while Mark was traveling and I had work obligations. I see, Judge Hernandez said in a tone that suggested she saw quite clearly. So Mrs. Morrison's presence was acceptable when you needed childcare, but unacceptable when you didn't? Amanda Chen tried to redirect the conversation toward legal precedent and parental authority, but Judge Hernandez had clearly formed her opinion based on the evidence and Sarah's unconvincing testimony. The court's primary concern in grandparent visitation cases is the best interests of the child, Judge Hernandez said, reviewing her notes one final time. The evidence presented shows that Emma Davidson, has had a significant relationship with her grandmother for most of her life, that this relationship has contributed positively to her development and emotional welfare, and that its termination has caused documented distress. She paused, looking at Sarah with the kind of direct attention that judges use when they're about to deliver decisions that parties won't want to hear. The court also notes that the stated reasons for terminating this relationship appear to be inconsistent and pretextual rather than based on genuine concerns about Emma's welfare. The respondent's willingness to accept Mrs. Morrison's care when convenient, while rejecting it when inconvenient, suggests that decisions were made based on adult preferences rather than child welfare. I felt Margaret squeeze my hand, understanding that Judge Hernandez was building toward a ruling in our favor. Therefore, Judge Hernandez continued, the court grants Mrs. Morrison's petition for grandparent visitation. She is awarded visitation with Emma Davidson 2 weekends per month, alternating holidays, and 2 weeks during summer vacation. This order shall take effect immediately and continue until Emma reaches majority age, unless modified by subsequent court order based on changed circumstances. The gavel's sound echoed through the courtroom with finality that felt like justice, finally asserting itself after months of arbitrary decisions and efficient disposal of inconvenient family members. Sarah's face had gone pale, her professional composure finally cracking as she realized that her authority to manage Emma's relationships had been legally constrained. Mark was already reaching for his phone, probably calculating how this court order would affect their schedules and travel plans. But I was thinking about Emma, about the security she would feel knowing that our relationship was protected by law, rather than dependent on adult whims. She would grow up understanding that love could be permanent, that caring adults wouldn't simply vanish from her life whenever their presence became inconvenient for other adults. Outside the courthouse, Richard shook my hand with satisfaction that went beyond professional success. "Congratulations, Evelyn," he said. "Emma's relationship with you is now legally protected. Sarah can't terminate it arbitrarily anymore." Sarah and Mark walked past us without speaking, Amanda Chen already discussing appeal options, though we all understood that appeals were expensive and unlikely to succeed when the evidence so clearly supported the original ruling. Margaret hugged me in the autumn sunshine that felt warmer than it had any right to feel in Denver in November. "How does it feel?" she asked. "Like justice," I said simply. "Not revenge, not punishment, just justice. Emma deserves to grow up knowing that love is permanent, that the people who care about her will fight to stay in her life." That evening, back in Phoenix, I called Emma. Sarah answered the phone with a voice that was subdued but not hostile, the anger apparently replaced by resignation, and perhaps the beginning of understanding that some relationships are too important to be managed like business transactions. "Hi, Grandma!" Emma's voice carried the pure joy of someone who'd been told that Christmas was coming early and often. "Mommy says I get to spend every other weekend with you, and summer vacation." "That's right, sweetheart," I said, smiling at Margaret across her living room. "We're going to have so much time together. We can bake cookies and read stories and do all the things we've been missing." "And it's forever and ever?" Emma asked, her voice carrying the hope that children invest in promises that adults have sometimes broken. "Forever and ever," I confirmed. "The judge said so. It's official." That night, I sat in Margaret's garden under the Arizona stars and thought about the journey that had brought me from Sarah's kitchen revelation to legal protection for my relationship with Emma. I'd learned that sometimes love requires fighting rather than just accepting, that protecting a child sometimes means challenging the adults who claim to know what's best for her. I'd discovered that dignity isn't something other people can take away. It's something you refuse to surrender. Most importantly, I'd learned that justice, even when delayed, could still be complete. Emma would grow up knowing that her grandmother had fought for their relationship, that love is worth protecting, that some bonds are too precious to be broken by adult convenience or arbitrary decisions. And I would grow older knowing that I'd stood up for what mattered most, not my own hurt feelings or wounded pride, but a child's right to maintain relationships with people who loved her unconditionally. Sometimes the greatest victory isn't getting everything you want. Sometimes it's ensuring that the people you love get the protection they deserve. I learned that silence isn't always weakness. Sometimes, the quietest battles are the most important ones to fight. And sometimes, the greatest peace comes not from forgiveness, but from refusing to let cruelty go unchallenged when someone you love is paying the price for other people's selfishness. Emma was safe now. Our relationship was protected. Love had won, not through emotion or pleading, but through law and evidence and a judge who understood that children's welfare sometimes requires legal protection from the very adults who are supposed to prioritize it above everything else. That was justice enough for me.